to follow up with what I've been mentioning about this overview, simple overview of spiritual life of the West. Many people have come, many of my students have come and said they have friends who are really spiritual. Well, they met this person the other day who's really spiritual. And so in going into the precision of that term, which is very important for us in spiritual life, to understand language in this way as precise use of terminology, because many times language is used in a way that is misleading and misguiding because of its imprecision and lack of clarity. I've noted, for example, many times I've read in media, in the newspapers and so on, magazines, that they use the term intuitive when they mean logical. So they keep coinciding these two terms and gliding them one into the other, and misuse of the term intuition for people who are really acting in a logical manner, which is supposed to give them the greatest sense of having more of an open-mindedness and clarity about a situation as they become intuitive, when really it's logic that they are embodying. And I think it's a common misuse of the term. But anyway, in regard to spiritual and becoming spiritual, and people who are spiritual beings, and many people parade as spiritual beings who are really materialistically engrossed, and they lead a materialistic life with a patina or facade or a shell of spirituality that they surround themselves with. And we have given this term, has come from the Tibetan teacher Trungpa, who called it spiritual materialism. So they mix these two facets, these two ways of being, and promote themselves, fob themselves off as spiritually based people. But there is a question to be asked, and a question to ask yourself, and it is a fundamental step that needs to be taken to make a turn to spiritual life, to climb the ladder of self-mastery, to become the master of yourself. And it is an initial step that has to be looked at to realize whether indeed you have taken this step up the ladder. Have you started climbing? And that has to do with a function that pervades all the traditions in the world. It was enunciated in the clearest terms in Christianity, but it's been elucidated everywhere. And that is a term called the three vows. The vows called obedience, chastity, and poverty. And the question to ask about, that I told the students to ask people who have come to them who claim to be spiritual or who appraise themselves as being spiritual, is to ask them whether they've taken the three vows. You don't become a spiritually related being or take this direction of this path unless these three vows are taken, whether explicitly or implicitly by yourself, in regard to the teaching that you're undertaking. So what's obedience? Obedience means, in the Western terms, comes from the root etymologically, which means to give ear to. To give ear to. And in the traditional lore, L-O-R-E, of the Western tradition, that is the spiritual foundation, Adam and Eve were in the garden and they were listening, they were giving ear to the one voice that was speaking to them and telling them about how wonderful their life is here. There's no in Eden, there's no disease, no death, happiness, eternal bliss, and so forth, and they have everything that they want. And so they were to give ear to the one voice. To obey is to give ear, is to listen to what you might call a higher authority. But the higher authority that we have in mind for us to listen to is the voice of the invisible reality, or the absolute one mind, or the source, or whatever term, the celestial guide, whatever it is we want to term that relationship that we form, that alliance we form with the invisible reality. And so obedience is the name of the first vow. Its opposite, the opposite, is one of attachment, in which we call it tyranny or murder. And tyranny and murder has to do with the assumption that we become the supreme being, and that everybody has to bow down to us and obey us, so that we become the masters of others, and we engage what's called the master-slave game. And doing that, it often takes the form of violence toward others, subduing others, freedom in putting others into bondage, and so on. So that seems to be the way that the world around us operates. In the spiritual terms, that world is called the man-made world, the world that's been grafted on to the divine world that was formed at the beginning through the, as described in the 6 days of creation. So we were given free will and choice, and so we devised and grafted a world on this divine world called a man-made world, which is basing itself on people arrogating to themselves divinity and becoming the divine rulers here and bringing others under their thumb. So there's the law of obedience, the vow of obedience, means I'm giving ear to something greater than myself. I don't become the great one. And by giving ear to the something greater than myself, that begins the movement of humility in ourselves, the way that we are seeing ourselves as humbled before the great absolute one mind, or the all. The second is chastity, which means to become faithful. So we become faithful to the one. And in doing so, again, these are elements of becoming free. And becoming faithful to the one, we don't allow any pollutants or contaminants or mixtures to enter into our direction. We become chaste, that is pure in our relationship to the one. And consequently, there's an opposite that takes place, which is is almost tantamount to a plague in the man-made world in the form of addictions. Alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual addiction, and so forth. And we allow ourselves to come into bondage by these addictions to outside sources and forces that take over our lives. You may or may not realize it, but about 75% of the world is addicted to one thing or another. Could be sugar, could be tobacco, could be heroin, could be cocaine, there are alcohol. So there are many sorts of addictions, and sugar and so on, etc. The obesity element, the obesity, so-called obesity epidemic that plagues America at this time is a function of the addiction to sugar that has caught up many people in its grip. So to be chaste is to be serving and faithful to one. To be the opposite is to be intoxicated, to serve something other than our relationship to the invisible reality, and to wander away from the alliance, to become drunk. And so the plant world, be it malt, hops, cocoa leaf, poppy, tobacco leaf, sugar cane, and so on, we can reel off quite a number of other vegetable substances, really control our lives. And we become slaves to them, and whatever that brings to us in terms of a decaying function in our own experience is the price we pay for that. And then there's the third vow, which is the vow of poverty. And it doesn't mean that we become poor in terms of living in a hovel and living with tattered clothes, etc. But it really means to release ourselves from our attachment to this material acquisitive function that exists in us to worship what's called in the spiritual life mammon. And mammon has been known as the god of evil, wealth, and avarice. And it draws us and lures us into attachment to the material substance and making that our master. So we become slaves to this what's called the greed factor, wanting more, better, and different. The vow of poverty has to do with a detachment from that desire, that acquisitive desire, and I've mentioned that earlier in the intuitive function. We have what's called disinterested instinct, that we don't use our instinctual urges to glom, to attach, to acquire, to bring to ourselves, which is then going to create a situation where we become a slave to what it is that we begin to accumulate and acquire for ourselves and seek to bring to ourselves, believing that that will give us happiness and the freedom that we're seeking. Yes, physical life may bring us a sense of freedom. You may understand that people like, let's say, Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg have an endless amount of financial wherewithal that makes it impossible actually for them to really spend it in this world. But they're free in the physical way from constraints and restraints surrounding money and the striving after money. The question for us is not that freedom. The question is internal freedom. That's what spiritual life is about, that we feel free and finding ourselves free of all the dependencies and contingencies that life brings. The other element beside the three vows is following the basic practice method that's been laid out within this alliance that I've spoken about, called the 10 laws. And the 10 laws are analogous, let's say, to the Eightfold Buddhist Path, to the precepts of every tradition has its precepts, has its laws, and we have 10 laws. And these 10 laws are lead us to another area of discussion that I'd like to inform you about and give you a taste of in our next installment.